Welcome to the Feminine Frequency. Today's an exciting episode because we actually get to record in person here in Asheville. So
Ooh.
we'll have some footage on this on Instagram and we'll be uploading it to YouTube as well. We'll be dropping those links for you ladies who are listening so you get to see me and Caroline chatting it up. But Caroline has been someone who I have really enjoyed connecting with here in Asheville, and I recently brought her on to do some consulting for me for the Feminine Frequency because I'm really inspired to continue growing this podcast, to continue learning how to be the best podcast host, and to really expand the value of this podcast. And Caroline really is the podcast queen. So welcome to the Feminine Frequency.
I'm so excited to be here and getting to share space with you and be in person and do it here at my studio. Like it feels really beautiful and full circle, and I'm excited to dive in.
Yeah, this feels like a long time coming. I'm surprised we haven't podcast together yet.
But it's the perfect time.
Yeah.
Because like this studio didn't even exist until like 7 or so months ago. So it worked out perfectly, as it tends to do.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. So I'd love to start by us just really dropping in and sharing a little bit about like why both of us started our own podcasts, because I know that there's a lot of women who have thought about starting a podcast or they've been dreaming about starting a podcast. And there's so many different factors that go into it and so many different reasons why people are afraid to start their own podcast. We're going to get into all of that today. But for our listeners who are new to your world, why don't we share a little bit about like what lights you up so much about podcasting and what inspired you to start your own podcast?
Oh man, what a question. So I have always felt like a storyteller through and through. Like I was put on this earth to tell stories and to be in deep conversation. I oftentimes, like the first podcast that I ever started called the Get a Helmet podcast, my little slogan that just kind of came through was storytelling changes the world. Conversation is like life's biggest adventure. Like these kinds of threads always came through, and I've always been telling visual stories and, had a camera in my hand. I'm a filmmaker. It's always been something that's been very, very, very like authentic to my soul. And I remember interviewing artists for this digital magazine that I was working for when I lived in Boston. And I loved it. It was like this tiny little publication online. I did that aside from my full-time job. I was working in production, and I would take the train from Boston to New York all the time and just find these different artists and sit with them and interview them, having conversations like this. And at first I started by taking notes in the actual interviews and conversations. And then very quickly I was like, that's taking away from me being able to be present. So I'm going to just start recording them. And this was like 2015, 2016, and podcasts were a thing, but they were not nearly as prevalent as they are now. And I remember being on the train and being like, all right, like I'm going to record this next conversation. I was talking to my sister Hannah about it, and she was just like, you should start one of those podcasts. I'm like, how do you do that? And she's like, I don't know, just like do it. And I'm like, okay. So then I literally just did. I just borrowed a microphone from the first person I ever interviewed officially for my podcast. I used his microphone. It was a photographer, my friend David in New York, and he was taking some photos of me. And I was like, should we just like record a podcast episode? He was so down, used his microphone. So the audio quality was not good, my first ever episode, which I really love to point people to go listen to that on the Get a Helmet podcast, because you shouldn't let that stop you, especially when you're getting started. Let it be messy. Let it get the conversation flowing, get yourself acclimated to sharing your voice. And then, I just kept doing it. I kept going with it. I had some guided meditations and practices on there as well that stood as episodes. And I loved it. And I started hosting live events that were Get a Helmet podcast events. And you can build such a community around your podcast because you are having conversation. And I believe so strongly that when you share, all of us, share who you are and tell your story and express that really truly and authentically, you inspire other people to do that too. And that's why I say storytelling changes the world, because it does. I mean, I have felt so impacted by people who are just showing up in their truth and sharing and then I can feel a part of myself in some of their experiences, and then you feel less alone in your experiences. So it's why filmmaking and podcasting and all forms of storytelling really have always just like been my first true love.
Mm-hmm.
And then one thing led to another, started my second podcast, and then people started asking me questions like, how'd you do that? Built my course. It was a pretty natural progression.
Yeah, I can so relate to that feeling of listening to a podcast and not feeling alone anymore in my experience, especially when I was going through a lot of health challenges and also both physical and mental health challenges. And I was really interested in holistic and alternative remedies. And at the time, one of the best ways to get that information from the top speakers and people in the industry was through podcasts. And so I would listen to people's stories and how they had healed. And I started to have hope for what was possible for me. And I hear that all of the time from women who listen to my podcast who have never talked to before. And maybe they've been listening to my podcast for 2 or 3 years and they reach out and they're like, this podcast changed my life. And it feels so meaningful and fulfilling, and to know that sharing my story and creating a space for my guests to share their stories and the ripple effect and the impact that that can make. And something really cool that has happened is that I've had this like full circle experience with a few different clients who have found me on the podcast, listened to the podcast, resonated with my story, resonated with my message and my work. Then they worked with me in a one-on-one or a group coaching capacity. And then they started their own podcast and had me on as a guest on their podcast, which I think is just like so phenomenal that that's possible. And it's such a cool journey to be on. And I started my podcast in like my walk-in closet. It was not perfect at first. I started in my walk-in closet because I didn't really know how to use a microphone. The microphone that I was using was picking up all this weird noise.
Totally.
And the place that it sounded the best to me was in my walk-in closet.
It's a great spot for it.
Yeah. And prior to starting my podcast, I did have quite a bit of practice because I used to host these weekly Facebook lives where they were called Weekly Wisdom, and I would post them on a Wednesday.
Cute.
And they was super cute. And I would just invite people on who I was interested in talking to and that I knew would provide value. And so I got about a year in, like 52 episodes in of practice before I even started my podcast, which was really cool. And I think that anyone who really enjoys having deep conversations and who enjoys learning and who is curious, like that's really all you need to be a good podcast host, right? It's like
definitely
it's and the courage to put yourself out there, which we're going to talk about today. But really, it's a skill set of relating and connecting, and that's something that's one of my core values is connection.
Yeah, me too.
And another one is authenticity. So for me, I find that podcasting feels like I can connect more than somewhere like Instagram or like these short social media posts where I can't really fully express myself in the way that I want to. And I love expressing myself through my voice, which is really hard to do online sometimes.
It is. I mean, there's so much noise, and our like attention spans are just dwindling, and we can either kind of play into that narrative or just say, what if we just invited everyone to watch something or listen to something that might be a little bit longer, that requires some presence, that might require some like grounding versus like the quick hit scroll. Am I going to get the information? Like hook them in, like that whole world, which there's so much efficiency to some of those things, right? Like to sell something. But that gets into the whole big conversation that's been like truthfully an existential crisis for me over the past couple of years of like art making and business owning. And where do those two things overlap? Can they? Do they? What feels good? And it's been such a deep exploration. And I've shared about that on my podcast, The Creative Visionary, because a lot of my people feel that exact way. You know, they're artists, they're deeply spiritual, creative women, usually. And they also want to make money doing what they love, right? And so your podcast gets to be this space to cultivate that genuine, authentic connection, to express yourself, to tell those stories. But then there's little pieces of strategy you can drop in to like make it profitable. So it's kind of been this world of finding that beautiful Libra balance, as I often try to find, in doing both, like being able to do both.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. And I'm curious for the people that you've worked with and like these artists and creatives and coaches who want to put their voice out into the world. What are some of like the insecurities and fears that you see the most? Because I know that it does take a lot to be willing to be seen and
Yeah.
willing to be heard. Like it brings us up so much for us. And
Yeah.
I'd love to hear what are some of those common blocks that you hear and that you see with your clients.
Well, it's exactly that. It's that being seen, being heard. It's those deeply human fears that we have in every situation that we're in. We're constantly trying to, how can we be more okay with that within ourselves, with our friends, with our partners, with, our clients? And the biggest thing, which is funny, is people being like, is anybody going to listen? Or who am I to start a podcast? And these just like very, very precious human vulnerabilities that we all hold. And then in addition to that, there's the like, where do I start? The technical kind of overwhelm. And for a lot of business owners and high achieving entrepreneurs, it's, I don't have the time. And I'm like, okay, well, your podcast is an incredible funnel directly into your business. If you have the genuine desire to start one, like that's huge too. That's something to listen to. So let's evaluate your whole life and your whole relationship with your business from the ground up. Like that's what that says to me. Before we even talk podcast, let's talk overwhelm and burnout and working too much, and that is, I'm guilty of it too. I mean, like all the time. And we all have different like seasons of doing that. But a lot of that comes up. I don't have the time. I'm already delegating things to people or I'm working with clients. And it's, when you actually step back, like that's abundance, right? It's like, okay, those are beautiful things. Let's restructure a little bit and implement some time for podcasting that doesn't have to be hours and hours and hours. That can actually work for your schedule. Mm-hmm. So look at how much time do you have? How much time can you create? Do you want to put out weekly episodes, bi-weekly? Do they all have to be hour-long interviews? No. You can start with 10-minute episodes. Like when I first got started, I was doing mindful minisodes and just knocking out like 3 or 4 of those at a time. And people loved them because you just drop right in, you get that takeaway, you get that inspiration that you're looking for, and then sprinkling in some juicy interviews. So, but it's those fears are just those deeply human, what if people don't like it? And I'm kind of like, well, then they're not your people, but those same fears are going to come up everywhere in your business, not just your podcast. So it's just like becomes a beautiful kind of healing conversation to have.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like that is such a part of the journey of being an entrepreneur and being a creative, is that there is this deep spiritual personal development journey of like, oh, like my fears and my insecurities are coming to the surface. Am I going to let those fears hold me back?
Yeah.
Which is essentially your ego. Or am I going to let my soul be expressed? Am I really going to lean into the thing that I'm feeling called to do?
Yeah.
And for me, a lot of it, I've had to face so much perfectionism when it comes to podcasting of, ooh, I don't like how that sounded. Like that was a big thing for me of, if I was being a perfectionist, I would not be able to get all the episodes out that I get out.
Totally.
Right?
Yeah.
And so I had to lean into being okay with, it's okay if I say the word like, it's okay if I say the word, it's okay if it's not perfectly polished, and people actually don't want that.
Right.
They don't need that. They want to feel connection. They want to feel truth. And yeah, it's been such an evolution for me to be able to share that. And, for me, like it's my mind, it's wild to think about because, and I don't really share my podcast numbers often, but like I have at least 1,000 people listen to every single episode. And if I think about
amazing.
standing on a stage in front of 1,000 people every single time in front of the microphone, like that can be really scary to think about. And so I really try to connect with, okay, what is it that I want to share, no matter who listens to it or how many people listen to it? And like, how can I stay connected to the message that I want to get across, right? And let go of the mind chatter of it needs to be perfect. And I'll be honest, there are times where I end up re-recording some things because it just, I value having a high standard for things. And I think there's a difference between getting in your own way with perfectionism versus like having a quality and a standard that you hold yourself to, because it is a representation of you and your brand.
Yeah.
And all of that. So yeah, and I think, a piece of who's going to listen to this, or another one that I've heard a lot is like, oh, there's already so many podcasts
Yeah.
out there. Like, why would I start my own podcast?
Yeah.
Right. And you guys, I didn't know who was going to listen to my podcast. I didn't know it was going to be a thing.
Yeah.
But I showed up anyways because it was something that I felt called to do. And I kept showing up and I
That's
kept
it.
showing up. And you and I were just talking before we hit record that, depending on your audience size, when you start a podcast, like it does take time.
Yeah.
And it does take that consistency, which is different to like Instagram. And even when I send out an email to my list, it's like, okay, I can see how many people open it. I can see how many people click on things. It's a different type of way of putting yourself out there and really just being consistent. And it's relationship building.
It is.
If people listen week in and week out, I mean, I have people who share they've listened to every single episode on the podcast, which is incredible. And then it's like we're building a relationship, right?
Yeah, you absolutely are. And what a beautiful thing to be able to do. And it's not necessarily this like behind the curtain, like on Instagram, quick hit relationship that's being built. You're sitting down and there are those little imperfections. You're sharing vulnerably. There's enough time and space, even if it is like a 10-minute episode, that is long form in comparison to Instagram content, So there's more space for being a human person and expressing that and other people to really connect to that. And, all of our nervous systems need some time to kind of connect with and to another person's story or nervous system and really anchor into it. And then there's a familiarity that's built, and then it's like, oh, and then there's a trust that's built. And so it's like any relationship, it takes a little bit of time. And every single like coach or healer or artist that I've seen their work or seen something of them on social media and I've wanted to learn more, I go and I look to see if they've got a podcast because I want to spend more time with them. I want to, if I got that kind of like stroke of inspiration or they're talking about a specific topic that I'm really, really inspired to learn about in that moment, I want to go like binge listen to their podcast on my walks and my hikes and doing the dishes. And that's just the world we live in. So you're really letting people in to get to know you, which, yeah, that's incredibly vulnerable. But you have to remember something I really, really connect myself to before I hit record or get in front of a microphone is there are people out there right now who are going to benefit so greatly from that one little thing you're going to say or from you sharing that story or listening to every single episode that you put out. And those people sending you those messages being like, this changed my life. I mean, holy shit, that is the most important thing, So, and then working with you or not, like their life is impacted and then they go start their podcast, they go start their authentic journey. I mean, that if there were more of that in the world, then it would just be a bigger and better place. So I really love to remember and think about me when I was struggling with anxiety. And one of the big topics I talked about on Get a Helmet was anxiety and my panic attacks and that whole journey. And I was getting messages too of like, you got me through a panic attack that I was having at work. And I know how that feels, So I'm like, damn, I feel complete in that. Like that makes me feel so happy. So remembering that no matter what it is that you're sharing or whatever it is that you do, there's someone out there who needs to hear that. And it kind of sounds cheesy, but like it's the truth. And to be ignited by your truth and your authenticity, like that's what art is in my heart.
Yeah. Yeah, what's coming through for me as we're talking is like this frequency that our voice has. And when you think about the media that people are consuming on a regular basis, a lot of people are consuming fear-based narratives and they're hearing things from different people that are fear-based. And I think when you can have something that you can plug into that offers hope and that offers a positive message or like an encouraging and inspiring and empowering message of some sort, no matter what area you're wanting to speak on, right? It's like we need more of that in the world. We need more spaces for people to plug into and find, information and also wisdom of what they're wanting. And I think we're living in a really cool time right now where you can plug into any podcast and learn so much information.
Totally.
Right? And when it comes to podcasting, like there's the fulfillment piece for me. And then from a business standpoint, because it's something that I enjoy the most, and I really believe that this is why my podcast has been successful, because I really enjoy it,
Totally.
is it has been the most like lucrative part of my business, meaning that my soul clients find me through my podcast more so than they find me through Instagram or anywhere else. And
Love that.
that has taken consistency. It's taken me really, leaning into my edges and using my voice. And there's so many layers to it.
Yeah.
But if anyone's wondering, like, is it possible to monetize a podcast? Of course. Like I right now and up until now haven't done any ads on my podcast. And I really like to, offer my podcast listeners to go deeper with me if they're wanting help with the implementation, because there is something different about, and I talk about the difference between like the consuming information and like it's like the mind, the masculine, like taking information and learning versus embodying and implementing, like doing the work. There's a big difference. And I do think we're in a time where people are consuming so much. Like I love podcasts, but I actually personally had to take a break for a while because I was like, this is so much information and like I'm not actually implementing it all. And
System
I'm just
overload.
like almost like addicted to listening to podcasts.
Totally. Me too.
Yeah. So I think there's this balance of, okay, let me take in the inspiration, and then it's like, okay, I actually get to implement that, and what changes am I making in my life?
Yeah.
And I think that that's an important piece that I always share on the podcast. Like I love podcasts and I love that you listen to this podcast, and like we get to be discerning of making sure that we're not over consuming.
Oh my gosh, totally. Just like nervous system stimulation. Like there's so much of that going on in our world with just being on your phone. Taking everything in. So just kind of sitting back and being like, I'm just going to be quiet and see what I still want to pursue.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I know that one of the things that you're passionate about is storytelling, and then also like using your authentic voice or finding your authentic voice. And so I think that would be really cool, because I think that, the voice is so powerful, and we can get in our head so much about what we're going to say or how we're going to say it. So I'd love to hear your take on like, what does that even mean, finding your authentic voice, and like, how do we support people to do that?
Absolutely. And I mean, just to be totally transparent, like even to this day, sitting here with you, as you're asking me that question, I can feel my mind want to go, what am I going to say? What am I going to say? What am I going to say? And my higher self can then come in and say, take a breath and just allow what your body's wisdom wants to share to come through. And that takes practice and trust. It takes so much trust. And every time people ask me that question all the time, and I swear I give a different answer every time, because there's little like avenues to get there. And one of the things you were sharing was you'd done these Facebook lives for so long that really kind of practiced those muscles, and we're kind of like little pre-podcast training. And so we're all at our own level there. And there's some people who come to me who are just getting started, who haven't really even shown up on Instagram consistently. So I'm like, well, start there. Like get in your stories and talk to your people like for 10 seconds. Go live on Instagram for 5 minutes and tell us about why you're doing what you're doing. And start to just get yourself acclimated, kind of like, when you get into like a cold plunge, or like if you're first time ever cold plunging and you're just like, holy shit, like this is so crazy. And then over time you learn how to use your breath, and you get to regulate in that moment. It's the same thing with everything. It's practice with everything. And people will oftentimes feel like, well, I need my podcast. Okay, great. I need to be super perfect interviewer, perfection. I'm like, well, that's not really how anything works. So you've just got to be willing to show up and take messy action, and to hold yourself accountable to like re-record if you need to re-record in the moment, or show up consistently dedicate yourself to practicing. And if even that feels edgy, getting on Instagram or whatever, well, if you want to do the business thing, you kind of got to like deal with that and dance with that and get more comfy with that. But leave voice notes to yourself. Like I oftentimes am like, we don't hear ourselves talk, like just from a frequency and like sound perspective. So leave yourself a little voice note on your phone and let yourself riff on something you're passionate about for 10 minutes and listen back to it and start to familiarize your system with hearing yourself talk. Share it with a friend. So those are the baby steps. And then other than that, like getting all the way up to being experienced doing it, it's like it doesn't ever go away. And that's why I share what I shared, because I feel like Oprah is experiencing that when she's on stage. There's a little bit of that's happening that's like just deeply human. That's never going to fully go away. And I think my relationship with that edginess or nervousness or fear has just changed over time, where, I would feel the fear in my body, or I'd feel myself start to overthink, and that would kind of take over and start driving, versus let's come back, let's trust ourselves, and, speak from the real truth of who you are, not this kind of story that's like, well, what would be the most like impressive thing for me to say right now? And God, if we let that pressure get to ourselves, like it's just going to come out sideways. So really practicing self-trust, practicing the way to do that in everyday life is to, if you make a commitment to yourself, like stay true to that. Whether it's a 5-minute breathwork practice or, going to bed before 10 p.m. or whatever it is, like that's building trust. So it might not feel totally related to podcasting, but it actually very much is, in the sense of like when you show up and you're getting interviewed or you're doing a solo episode and those weird feelings start to come up, you're going to be like, I trust me in this moment. So yeah.
Yeah, I resonate so much with everything you shared. And I love that you dropped into being like, yeah, right now in this moment, this is my answer. And it's different every time. And for me, it has been such a practice of self-trust and of trusting my intuition. Because as soon as I go into my head, like even as I'm listening to you, if I'm thinking, what am I going to say next? Then I'm not as present. I'm not really tuned in. But if I can breathe and I can stay open and I can trust that, whatever resonated for me to reflect or to speak on next is what's meant to be shared. And behind the scenes, I don't think my listeners know this, I've mentioned it maybe a couple of times, like I always, before starting an interview with a guest, I always have us stop and take a few breaths. And that's just as much for me as it is for my guest, because when you're going from thing to thing to thing, or if you have a call before or afterwards and you're not fully present, or if you're just feeling off, it's like take that time to get grounded and centered in yourself. That's where your authentic self lies. It's where your authentic voice is going to come from. It's from your channel and being connected to that. So getting quiet, taking some deep breaths, calming down your nervous system. And then it is a practice to, I'm in my head. Okay, come back into my body. And I love what you shared about doing little voice notes to yourself. I think authentic voice is also about like talking about what you're passionate about. And if you're like, I don't know what I'm going to say, it's like write down a few topics that you love learning about or that you love talking about with your friends.
Exactly.
And like, that is your authentic voice. It doesn't have to be complicated. It's just like talk about what you care about.
It's a really good point.
Yeah. And the people who are interested in that too and who want to learn more about that too are going to resonate with that.
Totally. I mean, because I think as entrepreneurs and people just creating things in the world, we think that we have to do so much with one podcast episode. And sure, maybe your one episode will really hit on a lot of points for one person. But I love to tell my podcasters, like, teach one thing. Share one thing and expand on it and go deep with it. But let's not overwhelm ourselves with, I've got to give a dissertation on this topic or it's not good enough. Like a lot of people are doing that dance with themselves. And I'm just kind of like, that's going to overwhelm people. Like just share 1 to 3 things that feel impactful. And speak to what, if you're in conversation with a dear friend and you're drinking coffee or tea and you feel like, I'm so excited about this conversation. I feel like alive right now. That's indication that that's something that you feel resonance with. So your people will feel resonance with that too. Share that, lean into that feeling and start there. That's exactly what I did. Like I did not have a business when I started my podcast. I didn't even ever think I would be an entrepreneur. I'm like, I could barely spell that word. It's kind of a tough word. But I was like, no intention of starting a business. And just have always felt really connected to what those things are that feel good to me and the stories that feel inspiring to me. And that's all that I really cared about. And then people just wanted to learn more about my journey with anxiety and mental health and nervous system. And then my work started to go in that direction. And then I kind of leaned back into filmmaking and creativity. And I've been all over the place. Mm-hmm. So permission to do that.
Yeah. I love all your different creative passions and how they weave, and how you've really followed those. And that's so true, that way, the thing that lights up your soul, the thing that you feel excited to talk about is what's going to be most resonant. And also, really leaning into your edges of vulnerability and authenticity of what your story and what your journey has been.
Yeah.
Things that you've overcome or things that you've struggled with or maybe still are struggling with. Like, It's not that you have to be on the other side in order to share it. It's like the humanness of, I struggle with anxiety or depression or body image or business or whatever it is. Like, that's what makes us human.
Yeah.
So those are some areas that I would invite people who are considering starting a podcast to dig into, is like, what are you passionate about? What lights you up? What do you enjoy talking about? What are some of your personal stories or client stories that feel inspiring and empowering for other people to hear?
Yeah.
And trusting that all of those are valuable.
Absolutely. And as you're talking, like, my journey over the past year and a half, 2 years, honestly, has been kind of feeling like a little bit of an uphill battle with the whole social media thing. And I'm just thinking to people who are like just getting started or in your business, and you have these things that you're passionate about and you really feel called to teach or do. And then there's all this kind of like chatter around, this is how to show up, this is how to make the content, this is what you got to say. It's like you're just inundated with like how to do it right? When there's like many different avenues. And while I'm so grateful to Instagram, because I've connected with so many people through that, but I reached a point where I felt kind of like I'm going against what I teach every day, which is do what feels good in your body to you. And I never really fully enjoyed doing that, if I'm being totally honest. And it kind of stopped working for me as well. And I teach podcasting and I love podcasting, and podcasting has always been my deepest way to connect with people. And I still felt resistance to totally leaning into it. I still feel that. And we're about to do season 2 of Creative Visionary. So really just like, for me, it was finally even starting the studio was the thing that was like, maybe you don't have to show up on Instagram as much as we're told we have to, or it's never going to work. We do have the opportunity to start the YouTube channel or the podcast and connect in these deeper, more authentic ways that feel really, really exciting to explore, versus if there's anything in your life that you feel like you're banging your head against a wall doing. For me, it was put out a reel every single day, do the thing. And yeah, sure, it worked, but I was like, oh my gosh, like I'm like kind of dying inside.
Oh, I so feel you. Like, as you're talking, my heart, I can feel this constriction, and I'm making some really big changes right now in my business as well. And I think it's so important as humans and also as business owners to really do these energy audits that I teach my clients how to do, which is like, okay, what parts of my life or what parts of my business are expanding me, lighting me up, like bringing me joy genuinely, and what parts are draining me. And I have a lot of just like, there's a difference between having resistance to something because it feels uncomfortable because it's a growth edge versus having resistance to something because it's not in alignment. And I think that's like the discernment that we learn on this path of like, what's my intuition and what's my fear? And it's like, I don't actually feel afraid to show up on Instagram. There's times when I enjoy it, but I think that it does have a big impact on my mental health when I'm too focused on it. And I genuinely feel like I thrive more with podcasting and long form content. So in the new year, I'm looking to start a YouTube channel. And I think, no matter where you're at in your business, I think it's really important to really take a look at, how is this in alignment for me?
Yeah.
Is it bringing me joy? And you can always pivot, So yeah, I love all these pieces, Caroline. And you mentioned earlier something about the piece of people feeling overwhelmed. Like, I don't have enough time to start a podcast. We talked a little bit about the strategy piece. people feeling maybe overwhelmed by the tech piece. And,
Yeah.
For me, I when I started, I was just like throwing spaghetti at the wall. I was really figuring it out as I went. And fortunately, I am a pretty organized person and I love systems. And
Yeah.
I at first was editing my own episodes, and then I finally hired an editor and, was having show notes made. And so it didn't all happen at once. It happened over time. But I know that in your course, you teach people from the foundation.
Yeah.
So maybe they can save some time and energy and the frustration and the overwhelm of like the tech stuff and the systems and figuring out how many episodes you want to put out a month and what do you want to talk about. Like your course does that all.
It does. It really does. It's a full immersion into this world where you're going to learn every single piece of that alongside people who are also experiencing that and having me with you too. Because it's a big undertaking. I'm not going to sugarcoat that. It's totally like, it's a big deal. But I love what you just shared about you started by editing your own and then you hired out and then you got somebody to write your show notes. And you didn't immediately just like start spending money on something that you had just begun. So that's a beautiful thing for people to remember. Like I teach you how to edit in spoken. We teach you the strategy, how to be a good interviewer. Like we're interviewing each other inside of the course. These practices of like taking some deep breaths or doing some nervous system regulation or just kind of getting into your power before you turn your microphone on. We're doing that too. So there's like the energetic and the spiritual and the nervous system and the creative energy and the tech and all of it, because it's one big puzzle to me. And a lot of these podcast courses that are out there, which are great, they're just kind of teaching you the tech stuff, which is very important. But then there's like this, like your mind is like doing this thing and there's no way to really drop in. So we try to do a little bit of all of it in the course, and everybody is inevitably on their own path. Some people will launch right in the course with us. Other people you have lifetime access to it. So they'll kind of keep the knowledge and they'll dip in later. And we all have our own little ways of learning. But yeah, one of the biggest things that we look at is like, what's your schedule look like right now? And how much time, are you a mom? Are you a new mom with children? Like I have a lot of parents, like a lot of moms that come into spoken. And so it's like, or you just it's just you and you're just getting started. You got all the time in the world and you're living off of savings and you just quit your full-time job. Like everybody's at a different part and space and time in their life. So we really just kind of start from the ground up and like, what are the things that you want to talk about? And before even getting into spoken, my podcast is filled with resources of like how to get to the root of what do I want my podcast to be about? Where do I start? And then I have my free podcast guide where it like really walks you through all those beginning steps. Like, where do I start? What is my podcast about in like 10 to 15 words? Who are my people? Who are my listeners? How do I communicate with them? What are my first 3 episodes going to be about? So that's like all in my free podcast launch starter guide, just because those are the things that people ask me all the time. So I just took like the top 10 first questions I would get from people and just put them in one place for you. And then, of course, if you want to go deeper, spoken is like, it always becomes more than a podcast course. It is like a creative mastermind at this point. Like we are going deep. We're talking about people are making shifts from teaching this one thing to another thing because they get into the course and they realize, actually, I don't care to talk about that anymore. And I'm like, well, let's not. Let's lean into the thing that feels a little edgy and new to talk about and your truth and your authenticity and dial that up. And I'll have to remind them again and again and again. I see you kind of going back to like being a little scared and not wanting to be fully seen here. It's safe out here. Like we celebrate that. And so doing that in a container with other women, as you know, and do yourself, like it's the most powerful thing. So yeah, I mean, it really has just taken on a life of its own.
Yeah, I love the holistic approach, the mindset, the strategy, the tech, the community, the mentorship. Like it's an incredible course that you've put together. And I'm so excited that you're going to be offering it again soon.
Yes.
So for our listeners who are curious about joining Spoken or even like diving into your world and getting your starter kit, what's the best place for them to find you?
Totally. So Creative Visionary Podcast is my most recent podcast where I talk about all these things. And we're going to do season 2 very soon, which is going to be more of an interview series with different creators and artists about their process and what they do, but still sprinkling in some podcast coaching in there because that's what I want to create, and I've done the dance of like, I can only make a podcast about this because that's what the world tells me to do. And I'm just like, I'm done doing that. I'm just like, I'm done. So that's there. And I'm still on Instagram. There's a bunch of content there for you. I haven't been super active, but there's still links and stuff there to get the podcast launch starter guide. We're going to run the next round of Spoken in October. So yeah, come say hi. Like, I still check my DMs. I'm on there. I'll probably be jumping on more and more as we launch the course again. But the podcast and Instagram, those are the two best places.
Amazing. We're going to link everything below, and you guys, Caroline's your girl. If you're looking to start a podcast to be in your storytelling, your expression, like this is where you got to be.
Yeah. Oh my God. I'm so excited that we could just keep talking for hours at this point. But
we could. There's so much more. I loved our chat. And also, thanks for hosting me in this beautiful studio here in Asheville. It's so fun to do in-person podcasting. I'm definitely feeling inspired to do more of that. So congrats on all the different ventures and creative projects and ways that you show up in the world.